Good evening. I am Reshat Kasaba. I'm the director of Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. And on behalf of the Jackson School and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation by Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Ambassador Pickering retired from the State Department as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs after a career spanning 5 decades where he served in each of the major continents. Ambassador Pickering reached the rank of career ambassador, the highest in the U.S. Foreign Service, when he retired. He served as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. He also was the U.S. ambassador and representative to the United Nations in New York, where he led the U.S. effort to build a coalition in the UN Security Council during and after the First Gulf War. He has held additional positions in Tanzania, Geneva, and Washington, including as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Oceans, Environmental, and Scientific Affairs, and as Executive Secretary of the Department and Special Assistant to Secretaries of State William Rogers and Henry Kissinger. After retiring from the State Department in 2000, Ambassador Pickering joined the Boeing Company as Senior Vice President of International Relations and member of the Executive Council, where he was responsible for Boeing Company's relations with foreign governments and the globalization of Boeing. He has retired from that position in 2006. So Ambassador Pickering is not a stranger to Seattle. He has been here a number of times, but as far as we know, this was the first time that he has come to visit the Jackson School and the University of Washington. And to show our appreciation, we threw him a big parade today in Seattle. We are very pleased to welcome Ambassador Pickering. He will speak to us on major challenges facing U.S. foreign policy. We will have time for question and answer and some discussion after his presentation. Ambassador Pickering.
Thank you, Dr. Kasaba, for that warm and very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here, and it is indeed the first opportunity I've had to address the Henry M. Jackson School. Having known as a very junior officer Senator Jackson, I know what he stood for, and I know what this school means, and I know how important it is, both in Seattle and in the state of Washington, but also for us in Washington, D.C., that other place by the same name, because many of the students from here become leaders in our government in the particular field of international relations to which Senator Jackson was so attached. Tonight, I want to speak with you about 3 things that are very much on my mind. One, some of the major changes taking place which affect our foreign and security relations and how and in what way they have changed the world in significant fashion. Secondly, about 7 major challenges that face us. And thirdly, interspersed with that, some ideas and thoughts about what we might do with respect to some of those challenges that are out there facing us, that are important for us and for our interests and for our survival. Let me begin, if I may, with changes taking place in the world. None is so important, and none is perhaps as well known here as any place else in the world, and this is, of course, the IT revolution. In many ways, pioneering efforts from the West Coast, from Washington, from Silicon Valley, and from other parts have played a huge role in changing how and in what way we communicate, understand what's going on, are alerted to issues around the world, are in personal touch if we want to be with many people from many different backgrounds and environments, and have speeded the pace of the exchange of information and indeed the onslaught of ideas in ways that I think were never ever predictable just a few years ago, and which of course mean that everybody almost everywhere in the world can stay up with almost everything if that impossible scope of a challenge can be met by any single individual. But at least they have the chance to pick and choose and indeed to be part of that world. It has changed how the media looks and how it operates. It has changed diplomacy in many, many ways. Informal communication is perhaps even more important now between governments and their diplomats and among diplomats themselves than it ever has been. Our ability to know and understand what's happening in the world is even more significant. And it means that we as a world leader, and I hasten to say at the moment the world leader, in many ways are both the beneficiaries of this enormous change, as well as from time to time the victims of it. And we need to find ways, obviously, to contend with that in our government, to get smarter, to get more capable, to get more effective, to know more about the rest of the world. It hasn't replaced the need to understand foreign languages and cultures in any way. It's perhaps heightened it. And it means, in fact, that ambassadors can now communicate with thousands of people in the countries where they're accredited by Facebook and Twitter and by blog, things that were never dreamt of years ago, and where their own personal input and their own personal stamp in speaking to the people where they represent the United States is remarkably important. And our ambassador in Moscow has announced this week his retirement. He was enormously successful in Russia in pioneering this kind of effort. Up to 60,000 people, it's estimated, read his blog in Russian on a regular basis. Other changes are taking place that are very important to us. We're paying much more attention to fundamental issues of economics than we ever did before. Perhaps in some ways more than politics, and indeed more than some security issues. And indeed economics is one of the bedrocks of our security. Years ago, Harry Truman was asked, what are our vital interests? And he said, well, our survival and our prosperity are our vital interests. And that's indeed true, and never more has prosperity been important for us than it is today as we seek to recover from the crisis of 2008 and 2009. We are becoming a world that is, in the jargon, more multipolar, more big players. And I'll discuss some of this when I talk about challenges, because that is a challenge. But it means that our leadership is challenged, but it also means it's more important, and it means that we have to spend more time leading rather than, put it this way, demanding. And in that sense, it's very significant. Our role as a major power is buttressed and reinforced by our military strength, by our economic capacity, and indeed by our principles, by which many people around the world came to know us and admire us, and about which from time to time they have become disappointed because, like all human beings, we're not able all the time, everywhere, to live up to those principles. I think it's also important to note that as this world changes, our leadership style will have to change to accord and accommodate that particular set of questions. China, Russia, and others, India, Japan, Brazil, will all be major players in the world, and we have to find ways more effectively to deal with them, and I'll touch that as I go ahead. And finally, I think strategically, as we look at the problems that face us, we have come to realize that there is an interconnectedness. For those of you who know your Bible, it was Elijah in the Valley of the Dry Bones who talked about them all being connected. And in many ways, from the Middle East to the economic crisis to dealing with poverty and development, we see long strings of issues previously dealt with perhaps in their own stovepipes in governments and beyond that are now very much interrelated. A primary example is the close interrelationship between energy policy, environmental questions, and that particularly important facet, as I see it, of the environment, climate change, that are all affected in one way or another. As we change our energy policies, we affect the other two, and of course, policy changes in those areas affect our energy policy. And we no longer, in a strategic sense, have the luxury of dealing with them separately, and indeed dealing with them on a more coordinated and interrelated basis gives us the opportunity to avoid the old bugbear of government policy unintended consequences on the one hand, and on the other, as we negotiate solutions to seek in broadening the equation for the negotiations to draw possibilities of bridging gaps from other portions of the set of policies we're dealing with. So in dealing with environmental questions, often countries will want to know, well, what are you going to do about your energy policy? And that set of interrelationships is important as we seek to find ways through the differences that are out there on these critical questions, questions which, if we don't work together, we are certainly going to end up working against each other. Against that backdrop, let me talk about some sets of questions that we are now either intimately involved in, have been for some time, or are going to be. Questions that may be addressed by stovepipe thinking, but cannot be, in fact, resolved without strategic thinking across the full gamut of the collection of questions under each one of the headings that I will raise. Let me begin with something that I've already mentioned just a moment ago, the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. I think that if I said something like home mortgages, threats of bank failures, threats of collapse of major industries and financial institutions, international ramifications for macroeconomic policy, challenges to the regulation internationally of the banking community, impacts on trade, you would have a sense of some of the ramifications of the financial crisis and indeed the need to address it on a very broad basis. My hope is that we are coming out, and it appears that way. The Europeans lag behind us, and countries like Greece and Portugal and even Spain and others are still threatened by some of the ramifications of that crisis. We have moved to try to strengthen international institutions dealing with banks. And we have done other things that are important, and we will soon, I believe, move away from qualitative enhancement, that is, using Federal Reserve money to prop up and strengthen our economy. And we're seeing some of the effects of that move already. Hopefully it will not put us back in a tailspin, but keep us moving carefully down the road in a cautious, but I think inexorable basis, because in effect we can no longer sustain ourselves forever by the old practice of printing money and not pay some price for that at the end of the day. It is, in every sense of the word, almost true that if one country, a major economy, cannot in its own way handle the significant challenges in ways that are straightforward, trustworthy, and understood, the effect will be wide and ramified around the world. And we don't benefit from that, and neither do our partners. And they will look to us for strong leadership in that area. Moving from that question to another one that's very important, let me touch a little bit on the wider Middle East, from Gibraltar to India. Certainly the full reach of the major players in the world of Islam. The most proximate, the most challenging, and in some ways the most difficult crisis for us is the change in the Arab world begun now some years ago in Egypt and Tunisia, but most affecting us at this stage in the disastrous consequences in Syria of the civil war that continues unabated. 4 factors, in my view, lead to the absolute necessity to continue to strive for a political solution to that problem. One is the mounting and continuing death toll, perhaps 125 to 150,000 people already, and ongoing 6,000 or 7,000 a month, including large numbers of innocent civilians caught up in the conflict. The second is one of the most important, the radicalization of the conflict, both on the side of the opposition and through Iranian help on the side of the government, President Assad, where the Iranians are training and equipping militias who often do the punishing work of attacking civilians as a way of seeking to expand the control of the government over the country. The third is a very difficult question of destabilization of the Middle East. Certainly Lebanon and Jordan, now Iraq, and certainly parts of Turkey are deeply influenced by the ongoing conflict in Syria. And finally, the vision that many people had 2.5 years ago, that in 3 months Assad would be gone and there would be a military victory, or on the government side that in 3 months, more or less, the opposition would be overturned and given their just deserts. The war has dragged on, and I know of no one who follows closely this situation who doesn't believe that the chances of a military victory by one side and the other, despite the seesawing, are certainly worse, in no case any better than they were some years ago. And so the imperative is, I think, for the international community to step up to the plate and deal with this question. Interestingly enough, so far, at least partway, the U.S. and Russia have cooperated on destroying Syrian chemical weapons, on setting the date for a conference, on indeed seeing that conference held. It was not exemplary, but for the first time we got Syrians in the room together. For the first time, the critical subjects of a ceasefire and a transformation in government were broached. Nobody believes there was any common view yet expressed. That will have to take time to come. But it is important because I believe that all wars end in one way or another with political implications of great significance to us and to others. And if we don't seek to shape them, then we're forced to live with the cards with which we are dealt by the other players. And that's not leadership, and that's not in our own interest, and it's important to play a significant role. Iraq, I won't go into at length. It is clearly a tragedy that Shia majority rule has yet been unable to find a way to assure that majority rights are fully recognized among the Sunni and to some extent the Kurds. That's the most fundamental problem. It's a long way from solution, and we have seen a new outbreak of violence in Iraq, and it threatens to continue unless there is a way to move ahead with that problem. Whether Iran and the United States share enough of interest in solving that is an unknown. Certainly the priority with Iran has gone to the nuclear question as the major issue of political importance, and it should be. But is there a possibility both in Iran, in Afghanistan and Iraq with Iran? I don't know, but it's important to look at. We have seen a recent breakthrough with Iran. It is far from conclusive, and we have much hard work to do. The agreement reached with Iran in November on nuclear questions helped to roll back pieces of their program which were most dangerous. It froze other pieces. It went beyond what I think most of us who have looked at Iran over the last decade thought would be possible, particularly in a first step. The challenge now is to deal in the second step with a comprehensive approach to reduce any possibility that Iran could rapidly take its nuclear program and move to a nuclear weapon and face us with a fait accompli. There are many ways and processes to work on that, including real limits on Iranian enrichment, the blockage of an Iranian approach through plutonium, increased United Nations inspections, some resolution of the problems of the past when it looked like Iran was making a nuclear weapon, and certainly a major challenge for us and our friends and allies about how and in what way to coordinate and syncopate sanctions relief with the steps we expect Iran to take so that it remains a viable instrument to persuade Iran to move ahead, while at the same time, over a period of time, as they continue to move ahead, we're prepared to provide the relief that is necessary to support that party in Iran which seems to be committed to working out the answer to this problem, a very delicate and difficult issue. Over time, we may see, as I mentioned a moment ago, an opportunity to speak further with Iran about other issues. There's nothing chiseled in stone here that says that's going to be easy, or that those problems can be rapidly or indeed fastly resolved. But there are opportunities, and if the alternative is either Iran having a nuclear weapon or us going to war, then I think it's far better, far more reasonable, a counsel of wisdom for us to see if, in fact, the negotiating route can lead to the answer. Pakistan and Afghanistan have been big problems for us. I don't know what we will do yet with respect to Afghanistan. Some would like to stay with small numbers of troops, some would like to get out. That will have to be resolved this year. What will be critical, I think, for us is that Pakistan remains an even more difficult problem, a nuclear-armed country with growth in internal insurgency led by fundamentalist Islamic leaders and organizations, which is now gradually assuming a larger amount of control in Pakistan, and with the Pakistani military, that will have to be addressed. Pakistan is a significant player in the region. For stability in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, two or three things I think are absolutely necessary. One is that the Afghan military forces and police, now over 300,000, will have to show, as they have over the last year, that increasingly on their own, they can provide that level of security necessary to provide stability, continuity, and change in Afghanistan. And secondly, Afghanistan and Pakistan will have to solve their mutual problems. They're moving in that direction, but very slowly. And Pakistan has suddenly awakened to the notion that the Taliban in Afghanistan, which they supported, have now in fact supported the Taliban in Pakistan, and that that's become their biggest security problem. and that they have to address that. And they will have to be successful if they expect to continue to have their country, to have it change, to have it progress, and to deal with the galloping economics and government problems in Pakistan. Let me shift to some other questions that are out there for us. One that I like to call rivals or partners: China, Russia, India, the European Union, Japan, Brazil, perhaps others, if you think of them. Continental states in the main, large powers, significant economies, growing in strength, adding to the multipolar dimensions that challenge our leadership and indeed open the door, but at the same time increase the stakes as we seek to lead to a safer and more tranquil and indeed more effective international system. I think that there are a few things I would say about dealing with these countries. One is that looking for major questions on which we share common interests, win-win, is very important to build a stake in mutual cooperation because we both benefit, and will help us overcome the concentration from time to time on smaller issues on which we have differences, which, if in fact we don't keep in perspective, become the major determinant of our differences, and Russia is a typical example of that. It's our descent into what I call ankle kicking with Russia that has led from time to time to, in fact, the failure to meet what we would hope would be reasonable expectations. President Putin enjoys ankle kicking because when his popularity goes down, ankle kicking the United States helps to put it back up again. And we seem to have fallen into the notion that if we don't kick back, then we have lost control. And that in itself is a major issue. I think the second question that's important in dealing with these countries is the need for direct, significant presidential leadership. And here I know that this is important. The administration and the president are often on the telephone to these leaders, make significant proposals. Secretary Kerry has worked very hard with them, and I think we can make some progress in that area. I think that a fourth set of issues that is important to us are what to do with weapons of mass destruction and how to deal with them. The basket is big. Arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, getting rid of gas and biological weapons, even accepting the challenge offered to us by four experienced Cold War leaders, Shultz and Kissinger and Nunn and Perry, that we should be taking a hard look at whether we can actually ever get rid of nuclear weapons, something about which many people have grave doubts, but which I think it is important, at least for us, seriously to consider. And there are ways of dealing with states who would seek to cheat, both with ballistic missile defense and new, much more accurate, much more readily deliverable conventional weapons. And so the door is beginning to open to some realistic opportunities here. But it will take a huge amount of time, and it will depend on very careful, very significant worldwide inspection and intelligence collection to assure that we can arrive there and stay there safely. I don't expect immediate moves in this area, but I do think that there are real potentials for continuing to reduce nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, first with Russia, And perhaps if we get down to around 1,000 apiece with the other players who are out there, all of whom would have to participate if the end is to move towards zero. Non-proliferation has been enormously difficult, certainly with North Korea. We've made some progress with Iran. With North Korea, I think China remains the key. And I think that we in China need to focus on opening an important dialogue about how we see the future of the Korean Peninsula between us. Do we believe in denuclearization? Do we believe in reunification? What does China think about having a united Korea on its frontier? How and in what way can we provide for the security and the stability in that region that we know will be the logical answer to the messy problem we now face in North Korea, with a young, inexperienced leader, with a problem that gets always worse before it slightly improves, and where the negotiating style of North Korea reminds us all of the worst tantrums of our 2-year-olds. I believe there is something that we need to be doing, and that should focus first with China. A worldwide problem that we have known for a long time is the issue that is best described by the words poverty, growth, and development. Large portions of the world suffer. The answers are in words like food, water, and health. And the ramifications find themselves in terms like failed and failing states, and disproportionate trade regimes, and the spread of international criminal activities in corruption and bad governance at home, in narcotics trade, and in migration. Not all of these have a common root, but many of them are influenced by the failure of countries to be able to meet their own aspirations, particularly in the economic and social area. We have for a long time, with others, provided assistance. We need better coordination of that effort. We need to continue to reward those countries where their leaders are committed to honesty and good governance, to reform and to change. But we also have to do something for the people who are the victims of bad leadership, not because they will it, but because they have no choice, and where humanitarian assistance to stave off starvation, to provide health care, and the rudimentary needs of education are all important as steps to be taken for the future. I mentioned in the earlier part of my discussion energy, environment, and climate change. I won't say much about it now. We can perhaps cover it in the questions. It is important, and we see the XL pipeline as one example of some of the controversies, as indeed we do the problem that will arise if we begin to export gas and expect to maintain low prices in the United States while we derive higher prices for exported gas overseas. I don't think that hound will hunt for a long period of time. We'll either see the bulk of our gas going overseas at high prices and domestic prices will rise, or we'll attempt to fence in the possibility for exports as a way of continuing to enjoy the advantage of considerable energy autonomy and low prices. And finally, let me say that we haven't made a major change in the operation of our own domestic government to deal with these problems since 1947. I don't think major new departments and significant reshuffles are the answer. But we need new ways to address the problems that we face in the world on a whole of government basis, something we don't do yet very well. This means task forces in the White House and beyond. It means new strong leadership on an interagency basis. It means perhaps new training and education for those people, and it needs a greater and more intense understanding of world issues and problems. And we face internationally many of the same questions. International organizations serve our interests in the main. They are scattered, they are multiple, and sometimes they're overlapping. I think when we come to talk about the United Nations, we fail to appreciate the unsung and unheralded role of what we call specialized agencies in making sure that the world works and it works together. Planes would not fly internationally. Communications would not go international. Mail would not move. We would know less about the weather. We would know less about global health and how to control epidemics, and so on, if we did not have these organizations out there working for us. They serve a huge purpose. They bring together, with treaties and cooperation, answers to these international problems, which we hardly pay any attention to because they seemingly work pretty well in our interests. And so there we are, a world full of interconnected and serious problems facing us, some new ways to attack them, and a changing and indeed ever-changing international globe upon which to work those solutions, to address those problems, and deal with those issues. And so, having given you this wonderful opportunity to torture me with questions, comments, and criticisms, I'm now going to turn this one over to all of you, and I look forward to hearing from you and to addressing your questions and hopefully your thoughts, new ideas, and visions for the future. Thank you very much. And I'll start right here because we have just 2 microphones, I think, and you're welcome to address me there or by loud harangues if you want. Please, sir.
Okay, just to reference it, because you mentioned the economic crisis, 1914 was, of course, 100 years ago, the beginning of World War I, also preceded by a financial collapse. I, however, don't think we're out of the clear on this one. I think we have yet a new one coming. And I think this puts an edge on the question of world war in this moment, which of course world war could only go nuclear. And you mentioned a number of the hot spots, North Korea, Pakistan, India. However, I would say you forgot to mention one, which is the question of Ukraine. Russia made it very clear to the Obama administration concerning the missile defense systems in Poland that they would be willing to deploy Iskander missiles to knock those out. Now, if the Ukraine follows under the European Union and NATO, that's a little too close for comfort for Russia, and has made that clear that that's a real non-starter. And given the European Union and State Department support of literal Nazi networks in Ukraine to overthrow the government, it just looks a little bit too close for comfort and very quick. And so I'd just like to ask just one question here concerning national sovereignty in the light of so-called humanitarian interventions, with Obama's Asia pivot and these various humanitarian interventions. And I'd like to read a quote from Medvedev at the time, who was president of Russia. He says, he talks about humanitarian interventions and how this does not improve the situation in the world, while rash military interference in the affairs of another state usually results in radicals coming to power. Such actions which undermine state sovereignty can easily lead to full-scale regional wars, even, and I am not trying to scare anyone here, with the use of nuclear weapons. Okay. So the question is, well, just the danger of nuclear warfare in light of these humanitarian interventions.
So thank you very much. We have a number of people lined up, so I will ask you to ask brief questions so that we can cover all of you or most of you. So, Master Pickering.
The questioner made a number of dolorous assumptions, which I don't share, but I won't talk further about them since I have talked about my views on those issues. Ukraine is an important question. Russia seeks, as I said earlier, to control or dominate space around it. It is a effort which is being resisted by significant numbers of Ukrainians, including those who speak Russian. The present leader of the Ukraine is being widely opposed in the streets. And we're supportive of what I would call the exercise of popular will in the country. I don't believe that anybody in this day and age would willingly hazard nuclear warfare for objectives that are important but so narrow, and where the remedy is so palpably dangerous and disastrous that we could see people moving toward it. But I worry, and always have, about the problems of accident, miscalculation, and misjudgment with respect to nuclear weapons. I believe that it's important now to see whether we can perhaps do everything in our power to move the European Union into a closer relationship with Ukraine. It appears as if that's the popular choice, and that will be the right direction. Putin, in many ways, is certainly trying to call our bluff, but some of the spirit of Sochi, at least, is working in our favor at the present time. And I would like to see us see if we can help, first, stabilize the situation, and secondly, build the ties between Ukraine and the European Union. I think NATO in Ukraine is a step too far, and I've always thought that. But I think that the solid relations between the European Union and Ukraine in the economic area are the right directions to move this particular problem. Perhaps over here?
Thank you for the talk, Ambassador. It was quite enlightening. I did want to focus a bit on climate change, as you talked about very briefly in your discussion. Recently, we've seen the IPCC and the UN as a whole put out increasingly disastrous predictions on the side effects of climate change as they'll take effect in recent years, or in upcoming years. And yet, at the same time, we've seen over the past 30 years, our political leaders repeatedly call for positive movement in the direction of devising solutions to climate change, and yet no real action being taken. And if I may be so bold to say, action taken in a quite detrimental way to the environmental movement. So my question to you is, how might we move in the political realm to positively invest in successful strategies for environmental sustainability and energy independence that do not interfere with the economic issues and rather put them aside?
I think the answer to that is as far as I know, that miracle is not available to us. And that we will have to undertake the economic costs of dealing with climate change. And that becomes very hard because while increasingly around the world there is broad acceptance of the proposition, there remains doubt. And the doubt is sufficiently large to counsel at least those who have to make the decision in the Congress against paying large amounts of money out on the supposition that the predictions for climate change will actually eventuate. And until we can find a way to overcome that, I don't think there is the kind of useful and helpful answer that your proposed idea would bring us. And I remain concerned that it's something we have to deal with. But I don't have a ready-to-hand, easy answer to bridge the gap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been reading a lot recently about the way the U.S. policy has been determined with regards to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And one theme I've really been seeing is, in a way, the marginalization of the State Department in the decision-making process, especially with regards to, say, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and former UN Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. And I was wondering, a lot of the people in here are being trained for careers in the field of international relations, but with the increasing power of the White House, the significance of intelligence agencies such as the CIA, and the increased power of the military in making decisions on foreign policy, is the State Department the place where people who, like us, who are training for jobs in the field of international relations, still the place to go in the future, or are we looking at increased marginalization as we go on?
Yes, and I offer you Secretary Kerry's leadership on Iran, on Syria, and now in the enormously difficult and tremendously trying Arab-Israeli peace process, where while we don't know all of the ins and outs of what he's been able to put in place, we see increasing signs that there is something really there, and the most hopeful aspect of that is that all of those who have the idea of reaping some advantage by leaking are not doing so. A quite interesting and indeed unusual set of circumstances in the development of negotiations over this particularly tense and difficult set of issues. I'm not sure where it will go, but so far I think that Secretary Kerry has balanced the process in ways that, in my view, show signs of moving ahead. And I think that a framework agreement is the next indicated and important stage. So if you're interested in diplomacy and you're interested in influencing foreign policy, I wouldn't give up on the State Department. Yes, sir.
Hi, yeah, I just have another question on the deteriorating situation in Ukraine. My question has to do with, it's come out recently that in many news outlets over in Europe and even some over here, that there's the driving force that the masses are gathered around right now, even, you know, waving the EU flags in the streets of Kiev, are actually rallying around neo-fascist circles that actually date back to the Ukrainian collaborators of Hitler, all the way back to World War II. And these networks, you know, and connected circles are right now involved in a major way in these protests. Now, my question goes to our State Department and the Western, the European Union's support of these protests that are largely being driven by these neo-fascist circles. How does, if if Ukraine falls to the EU, how does that not lead directly into the sphere of influence of NATO, and how does that actually, isn't that a red line for Putin?
My own sense is that, yes, there are certainly some neo-fascists among Ukrainian protesters. And it is the Russian interest to expand that to cover them all, which I don't believe is the case. There are neo-fascists in Russia who support Putin. That's no reason, obviously, necessarily to believe that all Russians who support Putin or all who oppose him one way or another fall into that camp. My own feeling is that the majority is not in that camp, the very large majority. And it will be incumbent upon them to separate themselves from extremism as it goes ahead. And that will certainly be something we will continue to ask of them as that process proceeds. But I think that my answer to the previous question also applies to your question in terms of the direction and the way in which we have to work this out.
Just to clarify, it is actually Obama who's supporting neo-fascists, not Putin.
Well, I think that we can discuss that question in a minute. I never said Putin was. I said the neo-fascists are not a majority by any imagination.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have a question about the long-term stabilization of the Middle East. So recently there's been a lot of reports about ISIS moving into Iraq, and I was wondering, out of the two terrorist organizations, being ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which one do you think has the most potential to destabilize the Middle East?
I think that probably Al-Qaeda, and you may be surprised, but Al-Qaeda has just tried to divorce itself from ISIS. I think on the grounds that perhaps they were too extreme, but I think it's mainly on the grounds that Al-Qaeda doesn't have a sufficient degree of control over ISIS. My own feeling is that Al-Qaeda is a widely ramified network of franchised organizations present in a lot of countries. If it doesn't choose to work with ISIS, that further limits ISIS's role to Iraq and Syria. And as a result, I think the question about destabilization has to be answered in the direction of Al-Qaeda.
Thank you.
Two more questions.
Sure.
Two more questions, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. And my question revolves around, you mentioned baskets and viewing multiple previously stovepiped ideas and issues in sort of as a whole, as a more full-bodied group of issues. I really like that idea, but I'm wondering how we as policymakers or current policymakers would be able to implement that and change the culture of stovepiping in government, whether that be through practical matters or through more rhetorical matters.
But I think that we need to think strategically about these questions, about the broader scope, about the broader set of ramifications, and about the impact on the United States. And I think an appeal to decision makers to look at the broader set of ramifications, in part because we have made mistakes in the past in not doing so, is the kind of answer to your question. Changing our culture takes time, but speaking out on these issues and speaking out about them is, I think, the direction we have to take. We are a country that is still, in my view, driven by logic and rationality, and these arguments have those virtues on their side.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your views. My question is in regards to the initiatives undertaken by Senator Kerry in recent months, particularly in relation to Iran, Syria, and Israel. And I can think of no better person than the former ambassador to the United Nations, Jordan, and Israel, to tell us, what are the potential chances for failure or success of these initiatives? Thank you, sir.
Well, I think that both the President and I think Secretary Kerry would agree with him that these are long shots. The President says 50-50 on Iran. I'd be now slightly more optimistic with the joint plan of action. I think with Syria, it's much less certain. And with Israel-Palestine, if I thought it was 50-50, I'd be a lot more optimistic than I am now.
So, before I close, I want to let you know that on March 4th, we will have Steve Heidemann from United States Institute of Peace, who will speak about post-Arab Spring Arab politics with a particular focus on Syria. And in May, we will have New York Times foreign correspondent Suzanne Daly, who will discuss her work in different parts of the world with us. These are all parts of the series of lectures we're co-sponsoring with Henry M. Jackson Foundation, focusing on U.S. challenges in a new world. I really admire Ambassador Pickering's stamina. He left Washington, D.C. about 5 a.m. this morning, and he's already given one talk downtown, spent over an hour with our students, answered questions from a smaller group before this lecture, and he spoke to us for over an hour and answered questions. So I want to thank him very much, and I want to thank you all for coming.